My background included a period as chairman of the State Sector Standards Board, which most of you would never have heard of. And it existed for 2 years, 2000-2001. It was a broadly based group. It included former PSA members, former head of the CTU, etc. And its mandate was to assess the ethos of the public sector. And we did that in some detail and wrote some 8 reports. And the action taken was nil. And that was a considerable insight for me into the state sector. I've never worked in it full time, but I've had a lot of roles around it. I chaired Department of Conservation after Cave Creek and basically looked after that for the next 2 to 3 years and rebuilt and restructured the department. I've been on the E-Government Advisory Board, Foreign Direct Investment Advisory Board, etc., etc. So I've got a few insights. In my day job, I've been strongly focused on the performance of organisations because I've mainly worked in the resource sector, included forestry, but a lot of it's been mining, iron ore, coal, gold, and so on. And as Fonterra is finding out, if you're going to be in the resource sector, you'd better understand what it means. And if you haven't got your organisation sorted and fit for purpose and as efficient as it can be, you haven't got much future. So that perspective is very helpful when looking at the state sector. The public service, key role in our society. It designs and considers policy options, and it designs final policy for implementation. It debates, recommends, it implements, and when the policy is in place, it manages it. And it has major powers which are very difficult for you and me, unless you're the Auditor General, to challenge or test, and it can be very expensive to do so. But fundamentally, the public service has a very big impact on the living standards of New Zealanders. But, in my view, there's a problem. And my assessment, and that of many other people, is that the public service has major weaknesses. And those weaknesses have been part of the public service for a very long time. And the best test to me is to read your daily newspaper. And probably once a week, you'll have a reasonably high-profile example of failure in the public service. And it may be a minor thing, or it may be huge, but it's a continual process of the public service failing to act effectively. Now, just a few examples. I've got pages and boxes of cuttings on this. So you could start with leaky buildings, the failure to regulate the non-bank finance sector through the GFC. So hundreds of millions of dollars of New Zealanders' savings were lost because of the regulatory failure. Solid energy, occupational health and safety. How could Pike River occur? You know, we've got state regulation of occupational health and safety, but it seemed to have absolutely no impact. Nova Pay, corrections and Serco, etc. Just a flavour. So what's the root cause of the problem? Well, in the 1980s, there were major reforms of the public sector. And the old public sector actually worked very well, but there was a lot of scope for improvement. And one, Dr. Graham Scott, who was head of Treasury through this period, was probably the key architect of those reforms and they were far-reaching and very important. And they lifted New Zealand's public service from being an also-ran in the global stakes to something that has been widely emulated around the world. But unfortunately, when the reforms were implemented, there was some critical unfinished business. So we're talking about the mid-80s, and that unfinished business is still unfinished and is the root cause of the problems. Now, importantly, you may take from this, well, it's the public service, we've got to sort it out, that's going to take 10 years. But my key message here is firstly that there's a problem, and secondly that there's a silver bullet. And I do have a 50 cal bullet at home, which is and my son was trying to persuade me to paint it silver and bring it in, and just to get the message across. So, what was this unfinished business from the 1980s reforms that turned out to be so critical? One of the key elements of the reforms was to greatly increase the power and responsibility of chief executives of public service organisations. And that was a very important and significant and potentially valuable move. But if you increase the authority of someone, you've got to increase their accountability. It's no use saying you are empowered to do this and then just leave them to it with no checks, balances or accountability. And that is the fundamental problem that we've got in the New Zealand public service. There have been, since the mid-80s, very few checks and balances. The power of an individual chief executive is very substantial. This has allowed them to focus quite narrowly on their own objectives and agendas, and things are improving a bit now, but for a long time there's been a serious lack of collaboration. Some collaborate, others are unwilling to. There is inadequate performance management, and I think the State Services Commission deserves to be let's say censured for its failure to provide the leadership and the management and the oversight of chief executives. And in the State Sector Standards Board's work, there was a very strong focus on firstly the selection of chief executives in the public service, which is often not what it might be, and then the failure to ensure that these people get adequate personal development, and finally the failure to censure or to have consequences for poor performance. Now, if you want to get a really good indication of this, there's a system working now called the PIF system, Performance Improvement Framework, which is actually a very good initiative. But the really interesting thing is to read the executive summary of the reports and leave it a year. Read the executive summary, most of them, many of them are strongly critical, and then see what's happened to the chief executive of the department that was giving this scathing report. 9 times out of 10, they're still in the role, they've been reappointed, or they've been promoted. Now, this has got serious implications for all of us. And there's a key thing in the appointment process. A lot of the senior civil servants are technically skilled. So if you're going to be at a senior level in Treasury, you've got to have a reasonable amount of financial or economic, etc., policy capability. But that technical capability doesn't automatically mean that you're skilled as a leader, a manager, a leader of people within the business. And there's a major disconnect. And the number of times you can track the career of someone who is technically skilled, promoted to a leadership role, lack the leadership skills to manage or lead the organisation effectively, and you just see either a single train wreck or a series of them. And you don't have to look very far. So, and this starts to get around to the silver bullet. The beauty of this situation, if I can put it that way, is that it's almost a single point failure in each case. And having been a chairman, a senior executive managing director in quite a lot of organisations now, I understand how this works very well. So the relationship between a chairman and a chief executive is a critical one. If that's not working, your organisation is in difficulty. If the problem in the public service is primarily with the chief executives, then that's a relatively straightforward thing to fix. And in my view, what should be done, I was going to quote, this is a book written by Dr. Graham Scott, and in it there's a chapter called An Integrated Approach to Top Personnel. Now, this was written 12 years ago, and yet the points I'm making now, which reflect the views of Graham 12 years ago, are absolutely valid and still a problem now. So all of the attempts to improve the public service, in my view, have resulted in very little change. And recently there's been a process called Better Public Service, led by Martin Weavers. I was involved to a minor extent in several aspects of it. I had a good look at what was going on. I understand where it finished up. It was a really good bit of work, but it's just quietly falling by the wayside. It's not being led and implemented in a way that will make a difference. So in the private sector you get failure all the time, and the difference between the public and the private sector is in the private sector there are consequences and there are responses. So you see chief executives being exited, sacked, and you see them being moved sideways, and you see square pegs being taken out of round holes on a regular basis. Now the private sector isn't generally better than the state sector. You know, they are each better at some things, but it's the failure in the public service to deal with the failure or poor performance of chief executives that really is the root cause of the problems. So my view is a small group of experienced people, a mixture of private and public sector, and a review process of 38 or 39 chief executives. Actually, it's a few fewer than that now, I think. They should assess their capability, competence and performance. They should have regard to the PIF reports. Their assessment should be made public. If you're the chief executive of a listed public company, there's not much about your performance that isn't public. And now that state sector chief executives are highly paid, they deserve to have the consequences of public acknowledgement of their performance. And in my view, it would take about 3 months to do that process. and it would take about another 6 months to go through a process of new appointments. And you need something like that rolling forward. You don't need the State Services Commission. You need something with a fresh and effective approach that continually monitors the performance of chief executives and mentors and guides them and helps them with personal development. Because the state sector does so little to help these people, if they're not performing well, to find a solution. So that's the problem, and that's the silver bullet. It's a simple issue, it's readily solvable, it's been around for a long time, and it's costing us as a society a lot of value, and value in terms of living standards, and if you get another billion at the margin, what can you do with some of the marginal social policy issues, for example? Thank you.
Kerry and I had a discussion earlier, and I told him if he spoke more quickly than he was planning, he'd have to answer questions, and he has, so there's time, Kerry, for a couple of questions. So not too many. Graham, you can go first, and then... Yeah.
When Ms Clark was Prime Minister and the State Sector Standards Board, I went to Cabinet Strategy Committee, debated this in detail, and not one thing was done. And it wasn't as if there were two business people on the Standards Board, Elma Toime and me, but as I said, former head of the CTU, two ex-PSA people, broadly based, but no impact. It's interesting to look at better public service, because that's 18 months ago, I guess, the final report was handed down, and it's a good bit of work, but it's falling off the wagon. Well, that's not an issue, because they're committed to acting in our best interests.
Some scepticism.
Oh, just
a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, is that enough? Do you want to say?
Oh, no, that's fine.
Yeah. That's all he's going to say to that.
Oh, well, I don't mind another one.
Oh, well, one more. There was Russ.
Well, I back my judgment on this stuff. I've been around it for a long time. You're entitled to your view, and I respect it, but I don't agree with it.
Thank you very much.
Good.
Heather.